And we'll start our broadcast on YouTube in a moment here. Hope some of our attendees that are logging on right now have been able to join other programs. And we'll start throughout the festival. So much is going on. Have you two had the chance to go to any other programs?
I work with Dr. Jaime Awe, who was your keynote this year, and I worked with him in Belize for several years, and Megan actually did her field school in Belize, so we talked to him every day, so it was kind of exciting to see him headline this.
Yeah, absolutely. Were you both able to tune in, or were you there in person?
Just tuning in. I couldn't get there in person because I taught late that day, but it was still like fun, like just thinking about, you know, I've been a part of the Flagstaff Festival of Science for years, trying to get a little bit out here and there. And there's so much archaeology this year. It's really fun.
Yes. Yeah, I think so too. I think it's been an awesome variety of programs and a lot of kids programs. Yesterday, I stopped by up at NASET. They had the coconuts, which is, the student group, and community members and families and kids could come and build their own robots. And then they did a race, like a robot race. So
yeah, it'd be so fantastic to like build robots.
Yeah, it was really neat because, you know, all these kids kind of arrived, everyone got there right at 5 o'clock and went like straight to work. You know, they were just like, okay, add this here and blah, 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 very focused. I was impressed.
Yeah, before the pandemic, we did a little hands-on bone demonstration at Willow Bend a couple of years ago. And that was so much fun because little kids are just so eager to touch things. They don't have the fears that adults have.
Right. That's true.
Absolutely. There's no inhibitions yet. They're just like, let's do it all.
Right.
I love it.
And folks, if you're just logging on, we'll get started in about 30 seconds, right at 5 o'clock. All right, great. Well, welcome everybody. You're here in tonight's presentation of Archaeology of Dogs in the Southwest. And I have a few pointers to go over with you all before we get started. My name's Elizabeth Vogler. I'm the coordinator with the Flagstaff Festivals of Science. And we also have board member Kathy Ferretta joining us this evening, hosting this presentation. And today we also have Chrissina Burke and Megan Laurich, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. Prior to beginning, I'd like to let you know that the festival is live streaming this webinar to YouTube. However, only the hosts and the panelists are visible or heard on the YouTube streaming. So you don't have to worry about your image showing up. However, you are here and with the hope to participate with a question and answer. So you'll notice down at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom screen, you have the Q&A section. You can ask questions in that box throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end. You can also upvote questions if there's a question that maybe you wanted to ask yourself, but then you can upvote somebody else's, and that way we'll know that it's a popular question. This event is a part of the Flagstaff Festival of Science, which we call the 10 best days of the year. And our mission is to connect and inspire the citizens of Northern Arizona, particularly our youth, with the wonders of science and the joy of scientific discovery. We have just a couple more days left in this 10-day extravaganza. And hopefully you've been able to attend some events, and there certainly are more coming up through Sunday. All of our events are free thanks to so many generous sponsors and donors. And so we'd like to give a shout out and thank them all. The full list of events can be found on our website, which is scifest.org. You can download the passport, and there's also an event calendar, so different ways to find out what's going on. If some of the events, they do require pre-registration, of course it is free, but you can find the festival's Eventbrite page on our website as well. So you can hook up with some of those pre-register events. If you've missed any events that you'd like to go back and check out, our YouTube page has everything on it there, all of the recorded events. So that would be like tonight's program and other live virtual programs that have been recorded. You can view those there. And I'd like to encourage you all to take a short survey after the completion of this webinar and any of the events you participate in. The data is really important to us so that we can improve our programs year to year. And each time you enter the survey, you are eligible to win a pair of Apple AirPods. So each entry is another entry towards that raffle. So fingers crossed for that. I mentioned the Q&A box. If you have any technical problems, you can add that into the chat. But otherwise, keep your questions to the Q&A, please. And now we are ready to introduce our speakers and get ready here. So again, this is Archaeology of Dogs in the Southwest. We have Chrissina, Burke, and Megan Laurich. Chrissina teaches at NAU in the Department of Anthropology. Her research focuses on the human-animal relationships through time. She questions whether humans can really be the innovative and social creatures we are without our relationship with animals. Science for Chrissina has become a way to connect with students by helping them question their world and engage with the wonder that all humans already possess. She lives in Flagstaff with a cat, dog, flock of chickens, husband, and stepkids. And Megan Laurich graduated from NAU in 2021 with a master's in archaeology. Her research in archaeology has paved the way for her to connect with students. Her experiences in the field and in the lab allow her to use real-world examples when she's teaching. She currently lives with her fiance and 2 cats in Las Vegas, Nevada, where she's working as a high school history teacher. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our 2 speakers and take it away.
All right, let me share my screen and get this set up for everyone. All right, and start my presentation, all the technical fun that we have. As it loads, all right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fun Flagstaff Festival of Science. Again, we're doing stuff on Zoom, but that allows us to bring this to a much larger audience. As Elizabeth said, I'm Dr. Chrissina Burke. I teach at Northern Arizona University. And I've been practicing as an archaeologist, more specifically as a zooarchaeologist, for over 15 years now. We're going to talk about dogs today, and I have a really great dog, and she may very well bark during the middle of this presentation. I'm sorry if that happens, but we'll all laugh that she's just adding ambiance to our presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Megan Laurich, and we are super excited for this presentation. I have been an archaeologist, or at least in school to be an archaeologist, for the last 6 years or so. And this research is essentially the culmination of my thesis project.
Excellent. Let us get underway on the archaeology of dogs in the Southwest. So first, let's recognize the land that we are on. This research was completed at the base of the San Francisco Peaks, which are sacred homelands to over 13 tribes throughout the region. As archaeologists, we work on their land, and we must maintain our respect for these communities and remain ethical in our research. So we honor their past through our research, we honor their present by including their voices, and we honor future generations that are interested in this research. We hope that everybody will understand that some of the goals of our research today are really to engage with Indigenous voices, and you will hear some different contexts of Indigenous perspectives on our research. To help us become a little bit better acquainted with what our goals are in this presentation, we have to discuss, the flow of the night. We have a lot of stuff we really want to share with you. This research is about 8 years in progress. I started this research in 2014 with the Museum of Northern Arizona when I started at the NAU. And Megan has completed our research with the conclusion of her master's thesis. So today, we have to first think about a few things. What is archaeology and zooarchaeology? And we want to help to make sure that nobody's left behind when we start to think about this specialized field of archaeology. We also want to talk about how archaeologists actually understand and think about dog domestication. And really thinking about dog domestication, not only the process, but how dogs have been valued cross-culturally through time. We also want to think about the methods that we use. Most of you think about archaeology as excavating, and that's great, we do that. But the research that we undertook for this specific project focused a little bit more on lab methods. So we want to talk about that to give you some more information on how we do research outside of the field. We also want to talk about how we came to the conclusions we came to, our interpretations, our thought process. And finally, we want to talk about the value of museum collections. Besides the fantastic museums at NAU, the Museum of Northern Arizona is the center of the research that I do. The access that they allow us to their collections really strengthens the archaeology in the region, because we don't necessarily have to take everything out of the ground to understand all the details. So let's start out with some basics about what it is we study. So most of you have an idea of archaeology, maybe from the Festival of Science this year, maybe previous festivals, learned a little bit more about what archaeology is in the context of studying artifacts, right? Studying the pueblos that we see in the region, studying cave sites, and even looking at human remains. Within archaeology, there's also a specialty called zooarchaeology. And this is the study of animal bones that we find in those archaeology sites, like the image you see here, which is from the excavation of archaeology site here in Northern Arizona. That's dog skeletal remains found within a kiva. And so besides all of the artifacts and the human remains and the architecture, zooarchaeologists looking at the animal bones are able to really start to think differently about how humans interacted with their world. Yes, we grew corn in the region, we built structures, but how do we interact with the animals that are around us? So zooarchaeology looks at the age of the animal, the sex of the animal, ideas like what animal is it? Is this a dog? Is this a mountain lion? Is this a deer? And we think about markings on the bones, like are there cut marks from stone tools? Have these bones been gnawed on by carnivores? And that allows us to start interpreting the relationships humans had with those people, yeah, animals or people, with those animals in the past. Given this kind of really broad research scope and focus, we have to work within the past through archaeology, but also add the animal context. Most archaeologists like Megan and I are trained in zoology, mammalogy, biology, history. We have this broad background because the stuff that we're looking at falls into many categories. In fact, one of my hobbies of birding has come in handy often in the context of my research and our research in general.
Throughout this presentation, you will notice we use a lot of quotes from Indigenous scholars, authors, and poets. We are non-Indigenous researchers, so we include these quotes in order to highlight and center Indigenous voices within this research. In zooarchaeology, a Western way of thinking, Western thoughts end up being prioritized. This inherently obscures truths and knowledge, not adhering to Western perspectives, thus removing an Indigenous voice, where an Indigenous voice belongs in the study of their history. Additionally, Western human-animal relationships are the unconscious standard by which all zooarchaeological research is held to and interpreted against. So in working with these concepts, we wanted to create a decolonizing research plan where we intentionally included Native American worldviews and theologies into our interpretation about human-animal relationships. This quote deals with a Indigenous archaeologist working in central southern Arizona discussing some dog figurines that were excavated while he was there. So these figures were in the center of a pit house alongside a huge pot that had been shattered by centuries of dirt and layers of civilization. A small dog stood upright. Its neck had been broken, then reattached, evidenced by a small cracked line. There were other dogs. These small figures stood upright as if the children had just left and would be returning to continue their play. So we need to start at the beginning, and we need to understand when and how dogs were actually domesticated. Domestic is of or related to home and family. So dogs were often buried as family members in the past and today in the present. Domesticate is a tame animal kept as a pet or farm produce, so thinking more like a cow. Wolves and humans have coexisted for well over 500,000 years, so the definitive date of domestication is often different between genetic and archaeological evidence. The most commonly accepted time frame for dog domestication is about 15,000 years ago, although other proponents have argued for older dates closer to 30,000 years. Wolves are highly specialized carnivores and predators. They evolved to consume meat and fish. With their domestication and integration into human settlements, their diets would have adjusted significantly to consume more human-created foods. Human leftovers would be things like remains for hunted animals or trash and refuse from campsites. Dogs and coyotes are present in several global creation histories. Stories centered on the mating between a human and a dog result in the created people represented as dog people, although not all dog people were the result of mating between human and dogs. In some cases, such as the Hichol and Arawak, a man is living with dog in a cave, following a flood, and is surprised when dog takes off her dog fur skin and becomes a woman. Similarly, coyote is a fixture in several creation histories. For the Southern Paiute, there were no men, so a mother sent her daughter into the world to find a mate. Instead, she found Coyote, and upon the return, Coyote hit her over the head with a stick. She gave birth to many tiny babies, each placed into a jug. Once full, Coyote took the jug and distributed the babies throughout the lands, becoming the founders of each plains tribe. Oral traditions are equally important in our understanding of dog domestication, and this table presents a few oral traditions about dog domestication. In India, for example, woman throws a bone to tempt wild dog in the cave. It worked, and dog struck a bargain. In exchange for woman feeding him, dog will guard the cave and hunt with man. There are several other oral traditions explored on this slide. For the Cree, there is a race between dog and wolf to see who will win the right to live with the people. Dog won and is now man's companion. The Cheyenne, on the other hand, captured wild dog and tamed him so that he would help hunt, carry, and guard. The Penobscot explained there was a meeting among all the animals to see who would live with and help take care of the people. No animal wanted to until dog stepped up and became our companion. The Wai people in South America were gifted dogs from the underwater Anaconda people in order to help them hunt in the lowland forests. Finally, the Iroquois discuss how dogs used to have the same status as man. We lived together, but then dog misbehaved and lost his human status. These are just a few examples of the myriad of oral traditions to show how important dogs are as human companions across time.
It may seem obvious with that thorough kind of thought process that there are varying ways that we view animals in our world. But Western thinkers often forget that cultures do vary. And so their thoughts on how dogs may have been incorporated into communities are often only considered from an archaeologist's cultural perspective, which is generally biased by Western thought. The types of dogs, the types of jobs dogs are assigned are therefore incredibly variable. Dogs were used to help herd, obviously, right? We see that today with cattle dogs on the reservation. Dogs were used to take care of, the trash on the site, maybe the garbage that was left behind, maybe leftovers. I know one of the things I do is we give leftovers to our dog and our chickens. Dogs may have been really powerful in terms of guarding, protecting any cattle if individuals had those, or sheep. May have been able to sound the alarm if a mountain lion showed up near the village or near the community. Also being able to remove pests like mice and squirrels and all of these animals that get mired in our food. Even thinking about using dogs for other, kind of aesthetic purposes, as we see here with dog fur sashes. The Fiber Festival here in Flagstaff, we often find individuals there taking dog hair, dog fur, and weaving it into yarn. We also know that dogs were buried in different contexts, potentially as grave goods themselves, interred by themselves, or buried in different locations based on their value to the community. In the Southwest, it's really interesting. We observe dogs in a more kind of variable context. They're not like the plains dogs where they were being used for bison hunting. They're not like the Arctic or subarctic dogs that were being used for transportation. Dogs in the Southwest appear to be used for all sorts of reasons. They were not domesticated into any specific sizes or characteristics. Instead, what we see is that the dogs may have served a more diverse part of daily life. When we think about dog burials and the context of dog burials, some of the other things we notice is that the dog burials are not uniform across the Southwest either. Sometimes the dogs are buried alone. Sometimes the dogs are buried with people. Sometimes the dogs are buried in kivas or community centers, sometimes in rooms, sometimes outside of structures. One of the dogs that we analyzed from the museum was found in a rock crevice in northeastern Arizona. And sometimes where they're buried is trash piles, what archaeologists would consider middens. So similar to the way we look at the diversity of perspectives on dogs today in even a Western lens or in our global kind of perspective, dogs in the Southwest don't seem to serve a very specific purpose, at least from our interpretations archaeologically. So considering that dogs are thought of as a member of our community, one of the articles that we read for this research, and I'll highlight later if you want to read it yourself, was thinking about the relationships that we have with dogs. And so Curtin and Hewitt note that it is true that whenever a person loves a dog, he derives great power from it. Dogs still know all we say, only they are not at liberty to speak. If you do not love a dog, he has the power to injure you with his orenda. One of the ethnographies that we read in preparation for our research over time was a story. It was buried within an ethnography about a ton of things, but there was a story about a dog who was living in a community and the dog was being harmed. And as the dog continued to be harmed by a single individual, that dog decided to go to the dreams of the people in the village and tell them that he was being harmed. So when we start to think about dogs in different cultural contexts, we have to keep in mind that our perspectives on animals vary and are allowed to vary. And that ends up being really powerful for us appreciating the diversity of humanity all over the place.
Going into this, there were several questions we wanted to figure out. First, what are the ages and sizes of the dogs? Second, what injuries or diseases can we see on the skeletal remains? Third, what was the relationship between dogs and humans that led to the observed injuries and diseases? 4, how can we use our research to understand human-animal relationships throughout time? And finally, how can we use archaeological materials from museum collections to decolonize archaeology? In terms of how we actually collected all of this information, data analysis was conducted through the use of microscopes, which took photos of pathologies or injuries, and tooth wear and calipers, which were used to take measurements. Data collection began with the demographic analysis of the dog remains housed at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Age was determined through fusion of animal bones as they grow, closure of cranial sutures, size, dental eruption, and tooth wear. Age is categorized into adult, subadult, and juvenile. Adults are older than 2 years, subadults range from 6 months to 2 years, and juveniles are true puppies from birth to 6 months. Sex was determined by the presence of a baculum, aka a penis bone. Size was broken up into small, similar to a terrier, and large, like a border collie. They were measured for overall shape through height, width, and depth. As mentioned previously, this research explores the pathologies of healed cranial fractures and tooth wear. Healed cranial fractures were commonly small depressions on the forehead of the skull and were recorded due to the unique pattern and mount of them. Tooth wear was recorded because of an extreme tooth wear pattern, meaning the cusps of the teeth were flattened instead of sharp. Take a moment and run your tongue over your molars. Do you feel those ridges? Those are your cusps. If you look at your dog or cat's teeth, you can see that they are super sharp. And imagine if they were flat or even concave. The tooth wear was recorded through several measurements and taken on the premolars and molars. The skeletal portion, like the bones of the limbs, were also measured and documented for healed pathologies. Some examples of these measurements are presented on the slide.
In total, we analyzed 96 dog skeletons. So over time, we found more and more skeletons, and Megan updated some of our measurement context so that we could get more consistent data. Of the 96, only 3 are probably male. And the reason that we argue that they're male is because of the penis bone, which you can see in the lower right-hand side of the slide. And yes, we've now said penis like 3 times, and children sitting next to you are probably laughing. It's all for you, children. Of the sizes of dogs that we have, 23% are the large size dogs, what we would think of as Megan said, a border collie. In the Southwest, that's the largest dog we see in archaeological context or domesticated, whereas in like the Great Plains or the Arctic or subarctic, obviously you have wolf husky sized dogs, German Shepherd sized dogs. And then about 75% of the dogs in our analysis are small. Think about like terriers. Of the ages we could identify, 53% are adults. And about 23% are subadults and 24% are juveniles. But you can see that some of the dogs, especially in these pictures, are in the middle. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see this kind of yellowed tooth that is the canine, and then right in there behind it is the adult canine. It's still coming in. So we had some dogs that were, losing their teeth, like you would think of puppies you've adopted, that sometimes you don't find those teeth, or maybe you find them in their poop outside. But generally you see that these dogs spanned wide range of ages, meaning that individuals were not necessarily keeping dogs of certain ages for any purpose. It wasn't like they wanted older dogs or puppies. And we don't necessarily have a predominance of puppies, right? About half of the collection are puppies to like teenage dogs, and the other half are adults. So we found that pretty interesting. So what did we learn in terms of pathology, the injuries that Megan was mentioning we were interested in? Well, we looked at these 96 dogs. The first thing that we noted pretty consistently, and it was interesting, we didn't notice it immediately when we were recording the dogs, because it wasn't necessarily very obvious. It looked maybe more like damage from being in the ground for a long period of time. But then we started to notice, and you can see it down in the lower left-hand slide. Basically, we found healed cranium fractures, like depressions, mostly shallow depressions. We tried to measure them, but they were a bit too shallow to give us any real measurements. And in fact, about 27% of the dogs had these healed depressions in their forehead, basically right above their eye orbits. We thought that was interesting. The fact that they were shallow made us start to really think about, well, what caused them? And so we interpreted whatever had caused it, either a hand or a tool. Some people have argued maybe being kicked by another animal, was actually kind of held back. It wasn't applied with great force to kill the animal. Whereas if you were being kicked by a deer that you were trying to grab as a hunting dog, you'd get hit pretty hard. But across the board, the healed cranial fractures really were pretty shallow and healed very well. So we don't think it was a lot of force. Maybe something that stunned them, but not necessarily a lot of force. The other pathology that we noticed was the tooth wear. So as Megan pointed out, carnivores like dogs and cats have really high, sharp teeth, the cusps that you can feel that are nice and rounded on you. Well, you're an omnivore, right? You can eat anything, but a carnivore is set up to eat the meat and flesh. So when you look at the dentition here in the image, you look at the top right slide or image, and you can see in the lower corner, there's a square. You can see the kind of cusps on that tooth that isn't worn. But then when you look at the larger images, you can see that the wear sort of moves like a slide coming out of the top of the teeth down into the tongue region. And that was just mind-boggling. In all of the studies in archaeology, we could not find any research that has ever found that archaeologically. In the Mediterranean region, in the Roman era, we actually found some dogs with these healed cranial fractures that were very shallow as well. And those archaeologists interpreted it maybe as a stun as well. But to date, besides talking to people in the Southwest at archaeology conferences, we have never seen a publication that actually talks about this wear. When we look at the teeth themselves, beyond the wear to the tooth, the other thing we see is called alveolar resorption. And you can kind of see it in that upper right image as well, where the bone is actually missing sockets for teeth. The resorption that we're talking about is the teeth are embedded in your jaw. And as you get older, let's say you have your teeth removed and you get dentures. Once you get dentures, within about 1 to 2 years, the socket that your tooth was in will start to close. And so in a lot of the dogs we saw, they would have the very worn teeth, and they would have all of the sockets that would have held their teeth completely closed up. In addition, we saw a lot of periodontal disease, which I know is something humans are familiar with, where you start to see your gums start to recede. That actually causes recession and resorption in your bone as well. And so besides the fact that these dogs had this minor injury on their head that had healed, so it wasn't something intended to kill them, most of the dogs also had these really worn teeth. About 29% of these dogs, especially the adult dogs, we didn't see it as much in the subadults, had very worn teeth, which sort of makes sense, right? You live your life very long, you're going to wear your teeth. But really, we wanted to know what's causing this wear and what's causing these healed cranial fractures.
So what relationship with humans led to these pathologies? Well, when Dr. Burke first started presenting this research, many archaeologists essentially just brushed it off saying, well, that's obviously abuse. But there were no clear definitions of what abuse in the archaeological record actually is. So we started doing some deep dive research, and we figured out what the qualifications are for abuse within veterinary literature. So like what your vets would consider is abuse or not. And then we also had to see how this has been interpreted in the archaeological record. So in the archaeological record, it can't just be, well, this dog has like a broken bone. It has to be several things coming together. So usually there are signs of malnutrition, as well as many breaks throughout the body and across time. So you're not just going to see like a couple feet bones broken and then call it abuse, right? Like it has to be showing that these are multiple, essentially like attacks happening to these animals. And then we had to take that knowledge that we gained and then compare it with the actual dogs that we had in front of us. So we interpret the healed cranial fractures as resulting from training and discipline. The chances for healing without infection are really good in these areas, and the impact to this region in the sinus and not the brain cavity would not cause death or severe injury. Similar head injuries from training and discipline have also been identified contemporarily. Healed head fractures are also present in subadults, meaning the activity creating them occurred at a young age. And that would make sense, right? If they are a product of training and discipline, as dogs are trained when they're young. So you don't want them, as they get larger, to continue the bad behaviors, right? And so the observed concave tooth wear and associated oral pathologies are tied to diet. Ethnographically, we know that dogs were used as pest control and overall cleanup crew, which led to a somewhat varied diet, including corn, pests such as mice, and any other food waste available. Corn is rich in sugars and ground with nanos and metates, which are stone tools, likely discussed in some of the other Flagstaff Festival of Science talks the last week. And they correlate with periodontal disease and dental cavities in humans. And that is something that we see throughout the archaeological record. And so we believe that that is partially what's causing this weird tooth wear pattern in the dogs. Dog injury is evident in the archaeological record, but is it dog abuse? Is the very mention of abuse bias in research? To identify dog abuse in the archaeological record, we need to see multiple points of trauma, which we're not seeing here. So we can't conclusively say that these dogs were abused. Most of the dogs in the collection were in overall good health. We have some dogs you can see are really old, don't have very many teeth. It would probably be really hard for them to eat, and yet are still living. That means they're being actively taken care of. There's a couple skeletons that have the potential for dog abuse. The first skeleton, skeleton 12A, exhibits two cranial fractures. One is healed and one is not. The unhealed fracture was created by a puncture wound, resulting from different activity than the healed cranial lesions. Additionally, this skeleton exhibits two healed fractures in the left ribs, which may have been caused by falling or being kicked from just being underfoot. Next, skeleton 90 is an interesting case because it is the only observed pathology in the cranial fracture, but it's farther in the back of the head instead of the forehead. This injury was likely from a fall and probably led to brain swelling and internal bleeding, which then led to death. This dog was notably a puppy with an unfused crania, and they have really soft bones, which contributes to the inability to heal and hence death. Overall, the dogs analyzed for this research do not provide enough evidence to conclusively claim abuse. And if we are going to situate abuse within the archaeological record, we have to be completely sure. The following quote is from two Lakota men who discuss how they view the relationship between the Lakota people and dogs. This relationship between Native Americans and dogs differs from one where the human is the master or owner of an animal who is considered property. Instead, the dog and people provide service to one another in a mutual relationship of reciprocity and respect.
So as Megan mentioned, what do we typically hear when we share these data? When I started this research 8 years ago, I went to public presentations, our archaeology conferences, and the minute people would see what we were showing, it would automatically be, oh, no, 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 that right there, that's evidence of dog abuse. That's what they do on the reservations. The dogs are abused, right? That was the first thing that was coming out of archaeologists, the public. It was a stereotype that was really problematic for me. And the question that we continue to ask is, how can we know that this is dog abuse? And is the argument that's being made that this is dog abuse based on reality? Or is it possible that this is based on, stereotypes and prejudice that have come in the context of how we have treated Indigenous peoples in North America for some time? A lot of the kind of reaction afterwards brought in that word, the res dog. And I'm sure you've said this at some point in your life. You go to any of the humane societies here, and the dogs that we adopt are sometimes called res dogs. And so where does that come from? And where does the idea that res dogs are abused come from? When we think about the term res dog, what it's meant, it's generally been used as a Eurocentric or a settler definition of a dog that lives on reservation lands, doesn't live in people's homes, maybe wanders around in groups of other dogs, sleeps outside, does not necessarily have regular food, etc. Sometimes that language, that term, can also be used in a derogatory context to refer to Native Americans and differentiate them from European descendants in America. On the reservations, though, we found that this is not necessarily always the case. The dogs, the res dogs, are often viewed as members of the community. The dogs have their own families. The dogs have their own personalities. Whereas many cultures, like a Western narrative, may think about these dogs as strays or feral. Really, that's not always the way that it's viewed across the world. For example, if you haven't yet, I encourage you to watch the movie Kedi, Kedi. This used to be on Netflix, but it's about the relationships of what we would call, feral or stray dogs in the context of cats. Kedi focuses on the feral or stray cats that are living on the streets of Istanbul. It's a really interesting movie, I guess, / documentary, because it kind of shows that not all cultures view things in the same light. To objectively investigate the patterns that we are seeing on these dog skeletal remains, and the different burial practices of dogs in the Southwest, we as archaeologists are going to have to decolonize the narrative. We can't use a stereotype that is being pushed in society today as our interpretation. Not only do cultures change, and not only do other cultures view the role of pets in different lights. So one of the things we had to do is decolonize this. And as Megan mentioned earlier tonight, we had to think about if the term res dog that often gets thrown around as a negative or as an indicator of abuse is really a problem that causes stigmatization to Indigenous populations and communities, that is intentionally or unintentionally being used to color the way that people see these dogs. And then, of course, the people and communities that live with them. As we quoted earlier, Richard Myers and Ernest Weston wrote an article, and you'll see on the side it says more information. Sapiens.org is an anthropology kind of like online newsletter / magazine that's really great. And last year when Megan was doing this research, Myers and Weston actually published an article on there called What Res Dogs Mean to the Lakota. So that they could really kind of think about that word, this phrasing, this phenomenon of the res dog in a way that wasn't, commonly thought of across the Western context. So what they note in this article is that in their culture, they identified themselves as Indigenous Lakota. People traditionally don't own animals. right, as was mentioned. The way other cultures have pets was not necessarily the same. Instead, they say the animals are left wild and may choose to go to a home to offer protection to that home, companionship, or even to be a part of a community. People may feed the dogs still and care for them, but the dogs remain living outside. They're free to be their own beings. Other research we found, if you're avid Twitter followers, is from at Dead Dog Lake. There was a really great quote here that says, res dogs are the superior people on the reservation because they don't care about pedigree. It will never cease to amaze me how res dogs are some of the only dogs in the US where we don't have pedigree charts, right? Like, you think about that. We're not breeding them to put them into dog shows. And it's not tracked, especially like the way that we try to track pedigree in humans when we think about indigenous populations and proving that they're Native American. I really liked that kind of thought process. And at Dead Dog Lake posted this picture. And there's also a video if you get on this Twitter account. The video was a documentary on Vimeo. It was 20 minutes. And when I watched it, it was interviewing people about the way they saw dogs. And a lot of the interviewed were just arguing a similar thing. Dogs are so important. They're so powerful. Look at how free they are. You know, how they get to live their life and own their day and run around and nobody is like in charge of them. And I thought that was really powerful. And then just on a complete happenstance, I found this Res Dogs book on Amazon. And it's a book written for children about how humans and dogs are engaged in community on reservations. And that book actually came out in 2001, and it's kind of commenting on how having the dog close to you allows you to survive a pandemic. And that really changes the narrative. And I would suspect those of you that have joined us today, you probably see your dog as your community too. And yet when we look at people from different cultures, sometimes we judge that they might not have that same thought process. Another thing that we want to consider when we're looking at this is that different relationships are going to happen across all cultures. Native scholars have argued that the Western narrative, the Western way that we say res dog, is a byproduct of knowing there's a lack of resources on reservations. If families are struggling to feed themselves, or as you see on the Navajo reservation, not necessarily having access to electricity, then the dogs being a part of the community at large is not necessarily something that's to be demonized, but it's something to understand in the context of diversity of cultures.
So again, there are only 3 skeletons, right, that have the potential for dog abuse. 2 we have already discussed. Skeletons 12A and 90 were both puppies or young adults, and we know that those aren't abuse, right? And so the only other one that we can really look at is skeleton 14. And they survived with the most injury, and they were an adult dog with 3 healed cranial fractures, a healed fracture on the cheek, osteomyelitis or bone infection to the tail vertebra, and that tooth socket resorption. The healed cranial fractures and healed fracture on the cheekbone could be attributed to training and discipline, while the injury to the tail is likely from getting stepped on or even wagging too hard and hitting it on something. The resorption is a result of diet, like we've discussed before. So we've officially debunked our 3 possible abuse, right? So like these dogs were not abuse. We cannot conclusively claim abuse. And it's clear that archaeologists need to decolonize their narrative about res dogs from within the field, but also to the public, as this research may unintentionally be used to continue stigmatizing Indigenous communities. So why do we care about any of this? Dogs are a large part of our lives today, so it's important to understand that that relationship developed and has changed culturally through time. Dr. Burke and I use these decolonizing theories to make this research more representative to and for Indigenous communities. To that end, examining the relationship between humans and dogs in the past, requires us how to review the human dog, requires us to review how dogs in Native American communities today are often depicted. To begin, the human-dog relationship is different on the reservations than in mainstream white cultures in many parts of North America. What I mean by that is there are cultural differences between these communities and their worldviews about dogs. Looking at the Bible, for example, Genesis 1:26 states that man is of a higher order and has dominion over all animals. Really shows a more Western view of animals, right? But we've already talked about the article from Myers and Weston that in Lakota communities, they don't describe themselves as owning their dogs. Dogs are left wild and may choose to join a home or community. And another example closer to home is found in Pueblo villages today. Dogs are often described as just around, playing with kids, scavenging, and attending outdoor events. That suggests we really need to ask ourselves what feral or wild populations actually are. Culturally, we define feral, wild, and domesticated differently. And remember, those terms are cultural concepts that are always changing. Essentially, the goal of this research is to better understand what our relationship with dogs has been like through time so we can see how it has evolved. And we are doing that through challenging those stereotypes we discussed earlier.
Archaeology is much more than simply a tool for understanding the past. Archaeological practice and knowledge produces, like all of the knowledge it produces are part of the history and heritage of people that live today. And there are complex contemporary implications and relevance for those people in daily life. As archaeologists working in North America, predominantly from white descendant Euro settler communities, we need to consider what our interpretations suggest and how they have consequences for Indigenous communities. We use museum collections in my lab, and the Museum of Northern Arizona curates collections that have been excavated since its founding. We've analyzed the animal bones from Wupaki and Walnut Canyon. We're analyzing the bones from Navajo National Monument across Coconino National Forest. And we use these museum collections to decolonize our westernized research goals. First and foremost, museum work, in a sense, is the master's tools because archaeologists created it. But I don't want to think about that as negative, because the museums have been housing these materials for a long time. And instead of me excavating new sites or, finding new caves, collecting artifacts that are already in the ground, I, as an archaeologist, Megan, as an archaeologist, can use these collections that have been stored to ask new and maybe more relevant questions, or really start to think about how our research impacts the cultures around us. Not only is it valuable to understand our understanding, right? Like to expand what we know about Northern Arizona through archaeology is great. We can use those museum collections. But by using museum collections, we also protect Indigenous cultures. We protect their history. We support their well-being by discontinuing the race to dig everything up. And we can support our communities better if we are recognizing that our research has real-world consequences. Without our relationship with the Museum of Northern Arizona, we wouldn't be able to find this information and really understand how our world needs to support and understand the Indigenous communities that were here before us. So hopefully our research is making a little bit of a dent in how we can do that.
Thank you all so much for listening and attending this talk. We would like to thank everyone at the Museum of Northern Arizona for their help getting access to these faunal collections and the associated legacy data. We would also like to thank NAU's Department of Anthropology for awarding me the Ray Madden Research Award, which really funded this research. And finally, we would like to thank Dr. Carrie Thompson, Dr. Nicholas Luluk, Dr. Ora Merrick Martinez, and Moana Lomabaya for engaging with us on the importance of decolonizing theory and centering Indigenous perspectives. Without their input, this research would be incomplete.
Thank you, everyone. We are free to take questions now.
Yes, thank you so much, ladies. That was really, really interesting and almost went in a direction that I wasn't expecting. I thought it was fascinating how you focused on kind of deconstructing the stereotypes and how that feeds into your research as well. Before we jump into questions, I am going to address this slide that's on the screen right now. It's our survey slide. If you all, our viewers, wouldn't mind taking a moment this evening and filling out our survey, you can do so at scifest.org. Or if you have your smartphone with you right now, you can actually take a little picture of that QR code and then fill out the survey later this evening when it's convenient for you. And I also want to thank all of our sponsors. I think maybe, do you have one more slide there? Yes. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this festival, these 10 wonderful days are free to the community, and it's only due to the generosity of all of our sponsors and donors. So I'd like to give a major shout out to everyone who supports this work and helps us create this festival for our community. So thank you so much. And now I'll turn it over to a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A. One question here is, are dog remains repatriated to the affiliated tribes in terms of maybe the ones that you've discovered or worked with?
I think, okay, so if the dog was associated with a human burial, yes. If the dog wasn't associated with a human burial, not always, because then they don't necessarily fall into NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, as a funerary object, right? Because there's the variability of how dogs may have been viewed throughout time. So we know that the ones that were buried with people have been repatriated.
Thank you. Another question here. The viewer says, I'm curious about the tooth wear and resorption in relation to the presence of animal bones in their diet. Could regular bone consumption prevent the resorption due to dietary lack of calcium, or is it lack of magnesium?
It's really interesting. Like, we've actually talked about this and done a lot of research on this, especially through the veterinary literature. Yes, dogs chew on bones, right? You could go to the grocery store today and buy a bone that a dog's been chewed on, or buy a bone that you can feed to your dog so they can chew on it. And a lot of people are like, oh, you know, modern domesticated dogs, don't feed them bones, it'll break their teeth. But it doesn't. Actually, dogs do not wear their teeth by chewing on bone, because bone is actually, it's kind of softer and plastic. Even though it feels hard, it's nowhere near as hard as like rock. So one of the things that we found through the veterinary literature, because, you know, we went out, besides ethnography, we had to go into that vet literature, because that is a key place in helping us understand the health, is that anything that happens to dogs' teeth that's incredibly damaging. Like, I have a dog that, you know, has chewed on rocks. When they chew on rocks, what you know will happen is that they crack the teeth, it breaks the teeth down because it's really hard. There's also in the veterinary literature evidence that dogs that are chewing on very frozen things, like dogs of the Iditarod, may also kind of start to crack their teeth. And there's evidence that dogs that catch tennis balls all the times, right? Their incisors, their front teeth will start to get weird wear patterns. But in the modern veterinary literature, we did not find anything that would be this way dietarily. Now, prior to this research, I studied carnivores and how they chew on bones. So I actually did my entire dissertation on how a dog chews on bone, or a wolf chews on bone, or a grizzly bear chews on bone, and the marks they leave behind. And in the mammalogical literature, so in zoology, there's no evidence that dogs can break their teeth or wear their teeth from chewing on bone either. So that's why we kind of defaulted to this being probably corn, because the pattern we see there in terms of human teeth, like when we eat a lot of corn and we look at prehistoric teeth that ate a lot of corn, it's worn down very similarly. And so we suspect that they were being fed corn, just like the people. Great question.
Another question that came in says, so what else do scientists look for in dog archaeology? You kind of touched on nutrition and diet, age, pest control. Like, what are other factors that you're looking for in this field?
Well, absolutely. A lot of people are looking at dog diet, and you can do that using stable isotope analysis to see if they're eating more plants or eating more meat or eating sea creatures. So nutrition and diet is huge, because whatever the dog's eating is normally what the people are eating when a dog's in a village like that. So that's really beneficial. Ages, absolutely. Thinking about the animals that are buried, whether or not puppies are being buried, whether or not adults are being buried. Pest control, 100% too. And, I presented this a couple of years ago in the Verde Valley, like our preliminary research, and a woman from the Iditarod told us, that often you'll see these relationships are built with that, or with the communities that are using the dogs to pull the tuava and the sleighs. And so there's a lot of archaeological research on the Iditarod too, and not necessarily the Iditarod itself, like the competition, but like the sleds that are being pulled by dogs. And we can see some of the injuries that happen from that, right? Pulling big weight on their backs. So there's quite a lot out there. Dogs, everybody loves dogs. So we're like, let's get the DNA. We want to know who they were domesticated from. There are researchers in Tucson working in Fish and Wildlife that we're looking to see if dogs have been domesticated from coyotes. So they look through the genomes of dogs and coyotes, and that is not possible. We don't see that ever happening. So we really love our dogs in Flagstaff. We need to know all this.
And we have maybe just one more minute for another question here, which you dove into quite a bit. So is our Western concept of the word abuse of animals an appropriate construct when we talk about prehistoric human-animal dynamics, considering the difference in the needs of our relationships?
Megan, what do you think about that?
I think you are hitting the nail on the head. That is exactly what we were getting at. Something that we found really interesting, just like in terms of abuse, I think like common in our like modern day, a lot of times like pets are family members, but I think that even discounts like farm dogs. And people have like called for abuse in terms of like dogs who live outside and they're watching the sheep and they are protecting the sheep in like different ways. But that's not necessarily abuse, right? Like that dog relationship is just different with that family than ours may be. And so I think that it's super problematic to use abuse in the archaeological past. And the only case where I saw that it like really made a lot of sense was a Roman burial, I want to say like in southern France, where these two dogs were found, and you could see that they were obviously very malnourished. Almost every bone in their body had been like broken at one time or another. And there was just like a lot of really clear signs of that abuse. But that's the only time in like any of the research where we've come across it's like, all right, you could call that one abuse, because you're right. There's so many different ideas about like what the human dog relationship should be, and we can't situate that into the past.
So interesting to continue to think about. We have run out of time, and I want to thank you both, Megan and Chrissina, for your presentation this evening, and thanks to all the attendees who joined us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening and a great rest of the festival.